A late evening inside a glass skyscraper in Chicago, the elevator doors slide shut on the 42nd floor. Inside stands Victoria Kane, a powerful CEO, heading down after a long meeting. Two men step in at the last second. The atmosphere changes instantly. One presses the emergency stop. The elevator jerks to a halt. Victoria's expression tightens. The men step closer. Their voices drop, threatening. In the corner stands a quiet man in a work jacket. Daniel Hayes, a single dad. He looks at them calmly and says 6 simple words. "You don't want to do this." The next second, everything goes silent. Destiny begun. Daniel Hayes was a man who lived in the narrow, dusty margins of other people's grand success stories. At 41, his presence was measured not by the noise he made, but by the profound silence he left behind. A shadow moving through the salt-crusted, wind-whipped canyons of downtown Chicago. To the thousands of high-powered executives who rushed past him every day, he was simply the man in the navy blue canvas jacket. He was the nameless technician who fixed the humming HVAC systems, the one who replaced the flickering lights in the massive marble lobbies, and the silent ghost who ensured the elevators ran with surgical precision. Daniel didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, after the life he had lived before, he found a profound, almost meditative comfort in being a man that no one truly saw. He preferred the company of logic-driven circuit boards to the ego-driven conversations of the corporate elite. His world was no longer defined by the high-decibel chaos and the searing adrenaline of his previous career. A decade ago, the name Daniel Hayes had been etched into the classified files of an elite military technical rescue unit. The kind of man who was dropped into active disaster zones or hostile territories to pull people out of crumbling buildings, burning aircraft, or sinking ships. He understood the structural integrity of steel, the volatile chemistry of human fear, and the precise, razor-thin moment when a situation turned from stable to lethal. But when his wife Sarah passed away during a difficult childbirth, the roar of the rotors and the cold adrenaline of the rescue missions began to feel like a betrayal of the life he had left at home. He walked away from the medals, the rank, and the glory, choosing a quiet life as a contracted maintenance technician, so he could be the only thing that mattered anymore. A present father. His 10-year-old son, Eli, was his entire universe, the sun around which his quiet world orbited. Every decision Daniel made, every extra shift he pulled in the freezing Chicago winter, was fueled by the single goal of providing a fortress of normalcy for his boy. Eli believed his father was a superhero, not because he wore a cape or fought monsters, but because he was a man of absolute, unshakable stability who could fix a broken toy or a bad dream with equal ease. Daniel taught Eli that true strength wasn't found in a raised voice, a boastful story, or a closed fist, but in the rare ability to stay calm when the world around you was screaming and falling apart. They lived in a modest apartment where the walls were lined with Eli's vibrant drawings of space stations and Daniel's technical manuals. It was a life of simple, beautiful rhythms, early morning pancakes, school drop-offs, and quiet evenings of 4th-grade math homework. On this particular evening, the hawk wind was howling off Lake Michigan, rattling the reinforced glass panes of the Kane Industries headquarters with a predatory intensity. Daniel was finishing a routine repair on a backup power relay on the 42nd floor. His toolbox was heavy, a familiar grounding weight in his calloused hand, and his mind was already on the roast chicken dinner he needed to cook for Eli. He was tired, his back aching from hours spent in a cramped, airless crawl space, and he just wanted to get home. He stepped toward the bank of high-speed elevators, his heavy work boots making a rhythmic, dull thud on the polished granite floors that echoed through the empty hallway. As the silver doors of Elevator 4 slid open, he stepped into the far corner, instinctively tucking his toolbox between his feet to stay out of the way. He was used to sharing these small, intimate spaces with the giants of industry, the men and women whose time was worth thousands of dollars a minute. He would stand in the corner, eyes down, waiting for the floor indicator to count down to 0 so he could return to his real life. He was a man who avoided conflict with the same precision he used to fix a delicate circuit board. He never sought the spotlight, and he never imagined that in a few seconds His quiet nature would be the only thing standing between a powerful woman and a calculated disaster. The doors began to close, and for a heartbeat, Daniel felt the familiar, heavy tug of the descent. But then, two sets of heavy hands jammed into the gap, forcing the sensors to retract. Two men stepped in, and the air in the small cabin suddenly turned ice cold. Victoria Kane was a woman who was accustomed to the rarefied thin air of the summit. At 36, she was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar technology conglomerate, a woman whose every public move was choreographed by PR teams and whose every private thought was guarded by layers of corporate security. But tonight, she had dismissed her detail early, craving a single moment of absolute solitude before the long, dark drive home. She stood in the center of the elevator, her eyes fixed on the shifting numbers of her phone, her thumb scrolling through urgent, encrypted messages from her European branch. She didn't look at the man in the work jacket in the corner. To her, he was just part of the building's infrastructure, as unremarkable and invisible as the wood-paneled walls or the recessed lighting. The two men who forced their way into the cabin at the last second did not look like they belonged in a corporate headquarters at 7 p.m. They wore heavy, nondescript parkas, their hoods pulled low to shadow their features, and they carried an energy of frantic, focused aggression that made the hair on the back of Daniel's neck stand up. Daniel's military training, a dormant but still lethal instinct, flared to life instantly. He didn't move a muscle, he didn't even shift his gaze, but his internal radar was suddenly scanning for threats, exits, and vulnerabilities. He saw the way the man on the left kept his hand in his pocket, gripping something heavy and metallic. He saw the way the man on the right stood too close to the control panel, his eyes darting toward the emergency override. The elevator had barely begun its downward journey when the man on the right reached out and slammed his palm against the red emergency stop button. The cabin jerked violently, the mechanical groan of the braking system echoing through the shaft as the elevator halted between the 38th and 37th floors. Victoria gasped, her phone slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the floor. She looked at the man by the buttons, her expression shifting from confusion to a sharp, cold realization of imminent danger. The silence that followed the jerk was deafening, filled only by the sound of heavy breathing. "What is the meaning of this?" Victoria demanded, her voice carrying the sharp, practiced edge of her executive authority. She tried to reach for the emergency intercom, but the second man stepped forward, blocking her path with his broad shoulder. "Stay quiet, Miss Kane, and this goes quickly," the man hissed. His voice was low, gravelly, and filled with a desperate, frantic kind of greed. They didn't want her jewelry or her expensive purse. They began to speak in rapid, rehearsed sentences about encrypted access keys, server locations, and proprietary data. This was a corporate kidnapping in the making, a tactical strike designed to extract information that could sink Victoria's company in a single night. The claustrophobia of the stalled elevator began to press in on everyone. The lights flickered as the system struggled with the sudden, forced halt, casting long, erratic shadows across the participants. Victoria remained composed, but Daniel could see the slight, rhythmic tremor in her hands. She was a titan in the boardroom, a woman who could stare down hostile boards. But here, in a 6x6 steel box suspended hundreds of feet above the cold concrete, her power was a ghost. The men grew more aggressive, their voices rising as they realized Victoria wasn't going to give up her passwords easily. One of them reached out, grabbing her by the upper arm, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric of her designer blazer. He shoved a tablet into her face, demanding a biometric scan. Daniel Hayes stood in the corner, his back pressed against the wood paneling. He looked to the untrained eye like a man who was paralyzed by fear, just another witness who was too scared to even move a finger. The two attackers glanced at him once and dismissed him entirely. To them, he was just a fix-it guy, a blue-collar bystander who would probably cry or beg for his life if they so much as looked at him. They didn't see the way his feet were braced at a perfect 45-degree angle. They didn't notice the way his breathing had slowed to a rhythmic, tactical pace that conserved oxygen and steadied his nerves. They didn't see the way his eyes were calculating the distance between his heavy toolbox and the lead attacker's knee. Daniel was waiting. He was observing the drift of the situation, looking for the specific moment of maximum vulnerability. He knew that in a confined space, the one who speaks last usually carries the most weight. He thought of Eli, waiting at home for his dad to cook dinner, and he felt a cold, hard resolve settle into his bones. The men were focusing entirely on Victoria, their threats becoming more graphic, their proximity becoming a physical assault. The air in the elevator was thick with the scent of wet wool, ozone, and the raw, metallic tang of impending violence. The lead attacker, the one holding Victoria's arm with a bruising grip, pulled a small, high-density data drive from his pocket. He shoved it toward her face, his eyes wide with a manic, caffeine-fueled intensity. "Plug this in, Victoria. Give us the bypass and we walk out at the lobby like nothing happened. Don't make us do this the hard way. We know you have a daughter. We know where she goes to school. We know her favorite park." At the mention of her child, Victoria's legendary composure finally shattered. A small, choked sob escaped her throat, and she slumped slightly against the wall. The man grinned, sensing the victory of primal fear over logic. He stepped even closer, his chest nearly touching hers, his breath hot and smelling of cheap tobacco against her skin. He was so focused on his prey that he had completely forgotten there was a third man in the room. He felt untouchable. From the darkened corner, a voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream or a frantic plea. It was a low, resonant rumble that sounded like the distant grinding of the building's own foundation. It was the sound of absolute, immovable authority. "You don't want to do this." The 6 words hung in the air like a physical weight, thick enough to touch. The lead attacker froze, his hand still gripping Victoria's arm. He slowly, almost mechanically, turned his head toward the corner. Daniel Hayes hadn't moved an inch. He was still standing there, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his work jacket slightly open. But the maintenance guy was gone. In his place was something far more ancient and dangerous. Daniel was looking directly into the attacker's eyes with a gaze that was devoid of anger, devoid of hatred, and entirely devoid of fear. It was the look of a predator who had already decided how the fight was going to end before it even began. "What did you say, old man?" the second attacker asked, stepping away from the control panel, his hand reaching for the heavy object in his pocket. Daniel shifted his weight, a movement so subtle it was almost invisible, yet it positioned him perfectly between the two men. "I said, you don't want to do this. You've been planning this for weeks. You think you're in control because you stopped the car, but you didn't account for the variables. You didn't account for the redundancy in the system." Daniel's voice was as steady as a heartbeat, his tone almost conversational, yet it carried an underlying vibration that made the men's skin crawl. Twist 1, the psychological flip. In his years of special ops, Daniel had been trained in high-stress de-escalation. He knew that a man acting on greed or desperation is always looking for a reason to doubt his own success. Daniel began to list the facts of their failure before they had even failed. He pointed out the silent alarms that trigger when an elevator stops for more than 60 seconds. He noted the thermal sensors in the ceiling that were already mapping their heart rates and sending the data to the precinct. He spoke about the response time of the tactical unit currently entering the ground floor. The attackers looked at each other, the first flicker of genuine, soul-chilling uncertainty crossing their faces. They looked at Daniel's hands, rough, scarred, and completely still. They realized they weren't looking at a janitor. They were looking at a man who had been in rooms like this before. Only he had been the one coming through the ceiling with a rifle. The silence in the cabin was now heavy with their panic. "You have 2 seconds to release her arm," Daniel said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a whisper that filled the entire cabin. "And 1 second to hit that button. If you don't, the next thing you feel isn't going to be the lobby floor. It's going to be the internal collapse of your own lungs." The lead attacker looked at Victoria, then back at Daniel. He saw the way Daniel's eyes were locked on his carotid artery. He felt the sheer, overwhelming power of the man's presence, a calm that was more terrifying than any weapon. Twist 2, the surrender. The attacker's grip on Victoria's arm loosened until his hand fell away entirely. He took a half step back, his boots squeaking on the granite. He realized that even if they had weapons, they were trapped in a box with a man who could kill them before they could even draw. The second man, the one by the buttons, fumbled for the control panel. His hand was shaking so violently he almost missed the button 3 times. He finally slammed his fist against the emergency stop, releasing it. The elevator hummed back to life with a comforting low vibration. The floor indicator lit up again, showing the rapid descent. 35, 30, 25. The silence in the elevator was now absolute. The 2 men stood with their backs against the opposite wall, their heads down, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Victoria Kane stood in the center, her chest heaving, her eyes fixed on the man in the work jacket. Daniel had returned to his original position. He had his eyes lowered, his hands tucked back into his pockets. He looked once again like the man who was just waiting for his long shift to end. He didn't look for thanks. He didn't look for credit. He simply watched the numbers count down to 0. The situation hadn't required a single punch, a single drop of blood, or a single loud shout. It had been resolved by the sheer, unadulterated weight of a man who knew exactly who he was. When the elevator finally reached the lobby and the heavy doors hissed open, the scene was one of controlled, professional chaos. Victoria's silent alarm had indeed been triggered the moment the car stalled. A team of 6 heavily armed corporate security guards was already waiting, their weapons drawn and focused on the door. The 2 men in the parkas didn't even try to run or resist. They collapsed onto the floor, their hands behind their heads, looking more relieved to be arrested by the police than they were to be free in that elevator. They were dragged away, their faces pale with a lingering fear that the officers couldn't quite explain. Victoria Kane stepped out of the elevator, her legs finally giving way under the weight of the released tension. A security guard caught her, ushering her toward a chair. She pushed him away with a sharp gesture, turning back to the elevator. Daniel Hayes was already stepping out, his heavy toolbox in hand. He didn't look at the cameras or the guards. He began to walk toward the employee side exit, hoping to slip away into the Chicago night before the paperwork started. "Wait!" Victoria called out. Her voice was trembling, the CEO mask completely gone. Daniel stopped and turned slowly, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Who are you? Truly? You weren't afraid? Not for a second." "I'm just the guy who fixes the backup relays, Miss Kane," Daniel said with a small, tired smile. "I'm glad you're safe. Go home to your daughter. Have a good night." He tried to keep walking, but the head of security, a man named Miller, who had served in the same branch as Daniel years ago, recognized the specific, confident gait. Miller stepped forward, his eyes widening in pure shock as he looked at the man in the work jacket. "Command Sergeant Major Hayes? Is that really you, sir?" Victoria looked from the security chief to the janitor. "You know him, Miller?" Miller nodded, his expression one of profound, hushed respect. "Miss Kane, this man was a living legend in the 1st Special Operations Wing. He was the guy they sent in when every other unit said the mission was impossible. He's been out for years, but I didn't know he was working here. I thought he was retired in the mountains." The realization hit Victoria like a physical blow to the chest. She had spent the last hour in a metal box with a high-level crisis specialist, a man who had saved her life and her company using nothing but the authority of his soul. She thought about the way she had ignored him for months. She thought about the thousands of times she had probably walked past him in the hallway without a single nod of acknowledgement. She realized that the most valuable asset in her multi-billion-dollar building hadn't been the proprietary data the men were after. It was the man who kept the lights on. If you believe true strength is staying calm under pressure, type, "I will live kindly." Daniel looked at the floor, visibly uncomfortable with the sudden attention of the room. "I'm just a dad now, Miller. I just wanted to get home to Eli. The roast chicken won't cook itself." Victoria walked over to him, ignoring the flashing lights and the cameras of the news crews gathering outside. She took his rough, scarred hand in hers. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked him in the eye, seeing the quiet hero beneath the blue-collar uniform. She realized that her world was built on the backs of men like Daniel, men who did the heavy lifting in the shadows so people like her could shine in the sun. She made a silent internal vow that Daniel Hayes would never be invisible to her again. The following morning, the sun rose over a Chicago skyline that looked the same as always, but Daniel's world had shifted on its axis. He was at the kitchen table, helping Eli find a lost sneaker for gym class, when a black executive sedan pulled up to their modest apartment building. A courier in a sharp uniform delivered a simple, cream-colored envelope. Inside was a personal, handwritten invitation to the top floor of the Kane Tower, not for a repair job, but for a private meeting. Daniel arrived in his best clean jeans and a flannel shirt, feeling entirely out of place in the pristine, hushed marble halls. But this time, every security guard he passed snapped to attention or nodded to him with a look of genuine, deep-seated respect. When he reached the 50th floor, Victoria Kane was waiting for him at the door of her office. She looked rested, her strength returned, but her eyes were different when they landed on Daniel. They were warm. "I spent all night reviewing your file, Daniel," Victoria said, leading him to a sitting area that overlooked the entire city. "Your service record is incredible, but what happened in that elevator? That wasn't just training, that was character. That was the kind of presence you can't teach in a classroom." She explained that Kane Industries was launching a new global security and crisis response division. They needed someone to design the training protocols, someone who understood that the best way to win a fight was to ensure it never started. "I'm offering you the position of Chief Security Advisor," Victoria said. Daniel began to shake his head, his thoughts immediately going to Eli and the grueling hours of an executive role. Victoria smiled, anticipating his concern. "The terms are yours to set, Daniel. Full flexibility. No travel unless you approve it. You'll be home for every dinner and every science project. And the salary? Well, let's just say Eli will never have to worry about a college fund or his future." Daniel looked out at the city he had spent a decade fixing from the shadows. He thought about the men in the elevator and the 6 words that had changed his life. He realized that he could do more than just fix machines. He could protect the people who moved the world. He looked at Victoria and saw not just a boss, but a person who had finally seen him for who he was. "I accept," Daniel said, his voice steady. Final scene. That afternoon, Daniel arrived at Eli's school 20 minutes early. When the bell rang and Eli ran out of the doors, he stopped in his tracks, surprised to see his dad standing there with a look of lightness and joy he hadn't seen in years. "Did you have a busy day at work, Dad?" Eli asked, grabbing his father's hand as they walked toward the car. Daniel looked up at the glass towers reflecting the afternoon sun. He thought about the elevator, the danger, and the new road ahead. He squeezed his son's hand and smiled. "Just made sure everyone got home safe, Eli. That's the most important job there is. Now let's go get some ice cream." They saw a man in a work jacket, invisible, easy to ignore. They never imagined the power inside his mind or the strength in his silence. But sometimes the quietest person in the room is the only one who can keep the entire world from falling apart. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Chip Healing Stories, where quiet strength changes everything.